So I do want to thank again Principal Nicole Enriquez and the Sherman community for hosting us tonight. And when we discussed where we wanted to have our State of the District this year, I thought it was important that we come to Sherman because the story of Sherman, the rebuilding of Sherman, is really a story that I think all of us can and need to learn from. So as David talked about, Sherman is actually one of the oldest schools in the district, but for a couple of years, in 2006 to 2008, Sherman was closed and rebuilt, and we have a beautiful physical campus that we're enjoying here tonight. But there was more than just creating a new physical structure for this school. The community was very clear about what it wanted in the new Sherman, in the newly rebuilt Sherman. The community organized and had many visioning sessions, and the community came together and said, we want a dual immersion English-Spanish elementary school here in the district. And we want that because we believe that in the position that our community is, that San Diego is, we're part of a global economy. And we want our students to be able to thrive in that global economy, and we believe if they're fully bilingual, that's going to give them a leg up. And at the time, the school board member for this district, unfortunately, although he himself was fully bilingual and bicultural, he believed that in order for young people to survive in this country, they needed to be immersed in English, and if they kept or didn't keep their native language, that was of minor concern. The key was, in order to survive, they needed to become proficient in English, and so the school district started to back down on its promise to this community. But the community said, we're too clear on what our vision is for our kids. We don't want our kids to survive in a global economy. We want our kids to lead the global economy. We want our kids to thrive, and so in order to thrive, we want to take what we have, which is a beautiful foundation, and we want to build on that foundation, and we want to be bilingual, and we want to be bicultural because that's going to put us in a position, that's going to put our kids in a position to lead into the future. And the community didn't just express what they wanted, they got organized. And they came together, and they had meeting after meeting in the community. I was running for school board at the time, and it was a powerful thing to be a part of and to be aware of. But this community said, it's too important for us. Our public schools, our neighborhood school is too important for us not to fight for it. And that community fought for what they believed their kids needed. And today, Sherman is not only one of the most outstanding public schools in our district, but I think this dual immersion elementary school is really a model for the rest of the country, has become a model for other dual immersion schools that have opened in our district. And I think we're looking at the possibility, the hope of these students being realized because of what this community was willing to fight for. We have a waiting list for this neighborhood school, and it's an example for the rest of us of what can be achieved if we care enough and we're willing to fight for it. So let's give a big hand to the Sherman community for that victory. In a couple of moments, we're going to hear from Superintendent Cindy Martin, who's going to talk about the amazing work that goes on every day in our district. Our students, our teachers, our classified staff, our parents, our administrators, our community has come together in school after school after school, and we're seeing amazing results for kids across the district, and we'll hear about those results. But I'm not in the classroom every day. I'm not an educator. I'm a parent. I'm a product of the public school system. My kids are the product of the public school system. But the role I play is I'm elected by you to represent the interests of the community in what we want to see in our public schools. I know that whatever resources we as a community provide to our schools, whatever the challenges our kids face as they come into school, I know that our educators will focus on those kids and will do right by those kids. We see it every day. But as your representative, I'm here to challenge all of us, because the honest truth is that if we reflect on the role we're playing as a community in supporting our schools are in the most fragile place that they've been over the course of our lifetimes. Our schools are in a fragile place because our kids and families are in a fragile place. Our kids in this expensive home, San Diego, our families have for years struggled to make ends meet, dealing with inequality in our economy. But now the housing crisis is hitting our kids and families like it never has before. We saw about 1,000 student decline in our predicted enrollment when the school year started. And although we need to gather all of our evidence, we believe anecdotally that decline is primarily due to the fact that it's more and more difficult for our families to afford to live in San Diego. We think we're seeing families move to the East County, and we know we're seeing families move out of San Diego County and out of California altogether. So we need to understand that the housing crisis is an education crisis. Our kids and our families are fragile because we know for years now we've seen the growth of an incarceration system that, as Michelle Alexander wrote about 5 years ago, has made too many of our families second-class citizens in their own communities. Too many of our families have been placed into, at one point in their lives, the incarceration system, and once you're in, as Michelle Alexander talked about in the new Jim Crow, it's hard to ever get out. Criminal justice reform is an education issue because it affects our kids and our families every day. And now, although it's certainly not a new threat, we've seen a magnified threat since the presidential election in our students and our parents and our families facing the threat of deportation. Tonight we have a courageous family who's agreed to come and allow us to share a little bit of their story. Could I ask Aime and Yahida and Ivan Casares, if you wouldn't mind to please stand and be acknowledged? Thank you. Amy and her husband Gaston, you can sit down, thank you. Amy and her husband Gaston are exactly the kind of parents that we strive for in our district. Active, involved parents, supportive of their kids' education. Yahida is a senior, a straight A student who's applying to college right now and hopes to be able to get into San Diego State and stay and contribute in this community. Ivan is a fantastic young man who's a freshman, both at Scripps Ranch High School. And Ivan has autism, but he doesn't let that get in the way of his coming to school every day and working hard for a strong education. And Amy and her husband Gaston have been there, incredibly supportive parents, engaged in the schools, and yet a few weeks ago, Gaston was taken from his family and taken from our community and was deported. Gaston came to this country when he was 16 years old, has been a contributor to our community ever since, an incredible parent, an incredible role model in our community. And the federal government found it in its wisdom that it was a good thing to do to take Gaston away from our community and away from his family. And so what we can do as a community is, of course, to wrap our arms around the family, to ensure, Yahida and Ivan, that you're going to have every support that you need to succeed in school and to succeed in life. We're going to be here for you every step of the way. And we thank you for your courage in being here tonight. But we also have to understand we've got to do more than that. We've got to come together as a community and be willing to fight for our families, fight for our young people, and stand up against this kind of injustice. And our schools are fragile, not only because our students and our families are fragile, but because the support that we provide as a community leaves our schools in a fragile place. We've told the story many, many times. My parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, coming out of poverty and into the middle class in California, decided that the best thing that they could do was to invest in a great public education system here in this state. And because of their sacrifice, they created what at the time was the world's best public education system. Our K-12 schools, our early childhood education, our community colleges, our Cal State University, our University of California. There was a vision from those generations of Californians that our primary responsibility is to leave behind a well-educated group of young people that can go forward and meet the challenges that they'll face into the future. And all of us have benefited from the gift that those two generations provided to us. And yet our generation has seen the investment in public education go from being the very top to we're now number 46 in the country in per pupil funding. And while we have disinvested over the course of a generation from our public schools, we have supported the creation of the largest incarceration system that anybody's ever seen anywhere in the world. And that's been the product of our generation and of this community. And so we need to take responsibility tonight and moving forward in acknowledging that while our schools are achieving great success, while our students and parents and teachers and staff and administrators and community supporters are doing amazing work every day, we as a community need to ask ourselves, like those parents at Sherman asked themselves, how important is it to us to fight for our public schools? Marshall Gans, who worked with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in creating the farm worker movement, Marshall talks about the process of people coming together and achieving positive change as a three-part process. The story of I, in which each of us asks ourselves, how important is it to us individually to struggle for positive change? And then we come together in the story of we, and we recognize that together as a powerful community, we have the capacity to create change. But then we need to come together in the story of now and recognize that we can't wait any longer to create the change that's required, that we've got to draw on our own power as a community to make that change. The story of my parents are immigrants. That's my family story. My dad came to this country from Colombia. He was the first person in his family in Colombia to leave his small town and go to the big city in Cartagena and go to college. And then he came to the United States and started all over again. Didn't speak English, couldn't take advantage of his education, had to work 3 jobs at once to support his family, had to go back to work. My mother's parents came to this country through Ellis Island from Europe, had nothing when they started out, but worked hard to create a future for their family, and my mother was the first in her family to graduate from college. And in our family's story, it's been the public schools that have made all the difference. The public schools made the difference for my mother's ability to come out of poverty and go to college, go to public college in this state, UCLA. It was the public universities that my dad was able to go and teach at and became a professor at San Diego State. But I think to them, even more important than that, it was the quality of our elementary, middle, and high schools that enabled their kids, that enabled me to be able to be in a position to stand here today and have this discussion with you. The public education system has meant everything to my family, and I would suspect, in fact, I'll ask, show of hands, how many people here would say that the public schools have made the difference in the lives of your families? I think so. The story of I is obviously, in our community, the story of we. But the question is, given the role that the public education system has played in our family story, is it enough to push us to be willing to fight? Are we willing as a community, as an education community, to raise our voice in the current debates about the affordable housing crisis? Are we willing to support the efforts of David Alvarez and his colleagues on the City Council to address in the most ambitious and aggressive way possible the crisis that makes it more and more difficult for so many of our families to continue to live here? Every time there's an attempt by people at the city or county or state level to do something real about the housing crisis, we need as an education community to lend our voice to that debate. We need to show up to those debates, and we need to make clear that the housing crisis is a schools crisis, because if we don't play our role, then it's going to be more and more difficult. It's going to create more fragility on our families and on our schools to see it become out of reach for people to afford to live in our own community. Are we willing to come together in the story of we as a community and fight for criminal justice reform and fight for comprehensive immigration reform to make sure that our voice, that the voice of the education community, is heard loud and clear in these debates? I'm proud of the fact that our district has so far, since the presidential election, stood up and said, we will operate as functionally a sanctuary district, and that we will not in any way cooperate with people attempting to enforce immigration orders through our schools. Our expectation that we will continue to fight for is that our schools will serve as safe havens where we will not allow immigration authorities to come onto our schools or onto our school buses. Just recently, under the leadership of our General Counsel, Andra Donovan, if Andra's here, if you could just give us a wave, we filed an amicus brief in support of the challenge to President Trump's executive order rescinding the DACA program. And we will continue to fight with and for our dreamers, but we will make clear as an education community that it's not good enough for a federal solution that protects our young people, but that deports our parents. We will not agree to that form of compromise, and we will fight as an education community for immigration reform that protects all of our students and all of our families and our entire community. And together, in the story of we have to come together as a community and say, enough is enough. We have to go back to an investment approach in public education and not continue to see this decline of investment in our schools. We know, we actually did a study a couple of years ago led by Superintendent Martin. What would it take, what would it cost to just eliminate the achievement gap altogether? We've done great work. We've seen rising graduation rates. We've seen declining suspension and expulsion rates. We've seen increasing numbers of students become bilingual in our district, arts and music, science programs, all the great things that we've done. But we continue to see an achievement gap that does not need to exist because we know how to solve it. We know what the strategies are that allow young kids as they enter our schools in kindergarten or TK who are behind at the time. We know what the strategies require to help those students become proficient in reading by third grade. And we know it's about lower class size. We know that we can do the best that we can if we have 23, 24 kids in a first to third grade class, but we know if we have 15 kids in a first to third grade class, both our own experience and national research shows us that the kids catch up and stay caught up. We know that to fully implement our restorative justice model, we have to invest in counseling support. We know we have to invest in more nursing support to protect the physical and mental health of our own students. We know that there are so many strategies that we see working for us every day and that have worked consistently over the course of a number of years, but to take those strategies to scale and to have the stability that we can move forward with those strategies and eliminate the achievement gap once and for all, we actually know how much that would cost. The cost is about an additional $3,500 per student. We've quantified it. We've analyzed it. We know what it would cost. California right now spends roughly $10,000 per student. If we spent another $3,500 per student in this state, we would still be below the national average in what states across the country provide in terms of per pupil funding. But we know that we would close the achievement gap with that additional level of investment. So what does that mean? That means every opportunity for increased revenue to provide the support that our schools need, we need to come together as a community and fight for. There might be opportunities next year to pursue local revenue measures, which we need to explore, and if it's a possibility, we need to come together and fight for those measures. We know that there's a coalition that's been working for several years at the state level to close a loophole in the commercial property tax system that allows large commercial property owners to not pay their fair share of taxes. And if we close that loophole, that brings in nearly $10 billion a year that we could put into our schools. We know, and being led by some of the leaders in the California Teachers Association and parent advocates around the state, that there's an increasing vision that in the year 2020, we should go from $10,000 per student to $20,000 per student, 20 by 2020. We need to get behind that effort. The level of wealth that exists in this state, I was just, my son is now working up in San Jose, and seeing the kind of wealth that exists just in that community in the Silicon Valley, we have the ability as a state to double our investment in public education and rise to the top again, which is where we need to be and where, as a community, we need to come together to fight for. Are people here willing to fight for our kids by addressing the housing crisis? Yep. Are people here willing to fight for our kids to face down the deportation threats? Are people here willing to reverse the generational slide away from investment in public schools to incarceration and make us number one again in this country in investing in public education? But if we're willing to wage that fight, we can't wait any longer. I've been on the board now, this is my 9th year on the board. We've all seen over the course of a generation what happens to our public schools when we don't stand up and fight. We had a group of students, I had the pleasure of speaking to 3 AP history classes at Lincoln High School last week. Dr. Kiki Ochoa, the teacher there at Lincoln High. And it was a great discussion. We were talking about the Constitution, the United States Constitution. And the students asked, well, we don't get it. It's obvious that a society that invests in public education is going to be better off than a society that invests in incarceration. We all see that. Everybody we know sees that. So why is the reality the opposite? And what we discussed is that in this country, change is hard. Our system is designed, our Constitution is designed with the assumption that if people don't stand up and fight for their interests, other people will fight for theirs, and the interests of the larger community will be trampled upon. Our Constitution assumes that we're in a competition of interests where even though everybody in this room would say we need to stand up and we need to invest in public education, that there are still people powerful enough because they're organized in this society that fight for the opposite every day, and we need to stand up and do our part. In this country, if we're not willing to stand up and participate and organize and engage and fight, and if we're not willing to do that now, then we will leave a legacy behind as a generation that none of us can be proud of. But if we are willing to stand up and fight for what we believe in, the experience that so many of us have been able to see when we saw the students here in the San Diego High Choir. Who here as a parent has experienced that moment when you see what your kids are doing in school, whether it's their exhibitions or you see the work that they've produced, and you say, my God, I can't believe my kid is that smart, right? Right? You've experienced that moment. I can't believe what my kids are capable of achieving. The pride and the awe that comes from that, I think that's I think that's worth fighting for. But we need to come together, the story of I, the story of we, and the story of now, to win that fight. Our friend Andrew Sharp here in the district reminded me of a play that Seamus Heaney, a Nobel Prize-winning Irish poet and writer, produced in the early 90s. And Seamus Heaney grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And his life experience was the experience of a community that needed to face up to a very difficult situation. And Seamus Heaney was cognizant of his own experience, but at the time he was also thinking about the need for the community of the world community, the global community, to come together to challenge apartheid in South Africa and to challenge so many forms of injustice. And Seamus Heaney wrote, human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracle and cures and healing wells, but call miracle self-healing. The utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. Let our outcry be the birth cry of this generation's newfound commitment to a public school system that is going to allow our kids to move forward and thrive and lead in the world in the way our Sherman parents believed it's possible. Let's make hope and history rhyme. Thank you.